Riley Brooks had spent most of her life dreaming of the perfect home, a place where every corner of the yard was an extension of her soul, vibrant with life and color. When she finally found the property she wanted, nestled in a suburban neighborhood that promised peace and order, it seemed almost too good to be true. She poured her energy and savings into transforming the bland, overgrown patch of land into an immaculate garden, installing a carefully designed irrigation system, rare plants from specialty growers, and hand-laid stone walkways that wound like veins through her personal paradise. It didn't take long before neighbors began to notice her work. Some admired it openly, complimenting her dedication and artistic sense. Others, particularly a certain clique led by Brad Hunter and Sharon Mills, weren't so generous. Brad, a long-standing member of the local association board, was known for wielding his little authority like a sledgehammer. Sharon, who had the presence of a steamroller and the tact to match, seemed to view Riley's success as a personal affront. At first, Riley thought she was imagining the passive-aggressive comments thrown her way at community gatherings, remarks about keeping things simple and not trying to stand out too much. But it wasn't imagination. Subtle hints soon turned into pointed suggestions, and then into thinly veiled criticisms. They said her garden didn't match the traditional aesthetic of the neighborhood, that it might confuse buyers or lower overall cohesion. Riley, polite but firm, made it clear that she had followed all landscaping guidelines outlined when she purchased the property and intended to continue maintaining her yard according to her own taste. She had no desire to start a conflict, and certainly no intention of being intimidated out of the home and garden she had worked so hard to build. Behind closed doors, however, resentment festered. Brad and Sharon, both bitter that a new homeowner was drawing more admiration than their own tired properties ever had, began discussing ways to put her in her place. At first it was small things, anonymous notes about imaginary violations, cold shoulders at block meetings, but Riley brushed them off, unwilling to escalate a situation she hoped would simply fade over time. She focused on her plants, her work, and her peace. Yet, as anyone who has ever crossed the wrong kind of petty authority knows, ignoring provocation is sometimes mistaken for weakness. The tension that had been simmering beneath the surface was about to explode into something no one could dismiss as harmless neighborly friction. The morning started like any other, the sun casting a soft golden hue over Riley's carefully maintained garden beds as she knelt near the fountain, adjusting the irrigation nozzles to ensure even coverage. The neighborhood was unusually quiet for a Saturday, but she paid little attention. She enjoyed the stillness, the focus it brought to her work. A gentle breeze stirred the air, carrying with it the faint scent of wet soil and lavender. She lost track of time, absorbed in her task, until the sharp, unmistakable sound of footsteps crunching across gravel pulled her from her concentration. She looked up to see Brad Hunter striding across her lawn with the kind of deliberate arrogance only someone intoxicated by petty power could muster. Behind him, waddling slightly and wearing a smug grin, was Sharon Mills, holding what looked suspiciously like a giant thermos cup, and whispering something under her breath that made her shoulders shake with laughter. Riley wiped her hands on her jeans, rose to her feet, and tried to school her face into neutrality. She had hoped they would take the hint from her previous refusals to engage in their drama, but it was clear that subtlety was not a language they spoke. Brad wasted no time, his voice loud and falsely casual. "Beautiful day for a little yard work, huh?" His tone dripped with condescension. Riley nodded politely, offering no more encouragement than necessary. She turned back to her irrigation adjustments, hoping they would get bored and leave. That hope was short-lived. She heard the hiss of a hose being dragged across the ground and spun around in time to see Brad gripping a heavy-duty commercial hose, one used by landscapers for high-pressure watering, pointed directly at her. The first blast hit her square in the chest, knocking the breath from her lungs and sending her stumbling backwards into a bed of ornamental grasses. The pressure of the water was no casual spray. It was strong enough to leave welts, to bruise, to injure. Riley gasped, coughing, struggling to regain her footing as another blast caught her across the side, soaking her clothes and knocking her hat flying. Through the haze of water, she could hear Sharon laughing uproariously, her voice shrill and mocking. "Maybe that'll cool you down, princess," she cackled, her words barely audible over the roar of the hose. Brad seemed almost gleeful, his face twisted in a sneer as he kept the hose trained on Riley, deliberately moving the stream to strike her legs, her arms, her already battered torso. Finally, perhaps satisfied or simply bored, he dropped the hose, letting it writhe like a wounded snake on the ground, and turned to Sharon with a self-satisfied chuckle. "Told you she'd get the message," he said, loud enough for Riley to hear. Dripping wet, shaking with adrenaline and rage, Riley forced herself to stand upright. Every rational part of her brain screamed for her to keep calm, to document, to act smart, not emotional. She took a deep breath, ignoring the aches beginning to spread through her limbs, and with quiet precision pulled her phone from her pocket. Not to record a video, not to yell at them, but to call emergency services. Her voice, when she spoke to the dispatcher, was calm, clipped, controlled. She reported an assault. She requested medical attention. She gave her address and a brief description of the attackers without embellishment. Brad and Sharon, perhaps realizing too late that things had escalated beyond a prank, exchanged a nervous glance. Sharon took a few uncertain steps back toward the sidewalk. Brad opened his mouth, perhaps to bluster or deny or joke it off, but Riley cut him off with a single measured sentence. "You need to leave. Now!" Something in her tone, cold, clear, unshakable, must have registered because, without another word, they retreated, Sharon muttering under her breath as she waddled after Brad, clutching her oversized cup like a shield. Within minutes, the paramedics arrived, followed closely by 2 patrol officers. Riley, soaked to the bone and visibly bruised, submitted herself to examination without protest. She answered every question simply and honestly, showing them the high-powered hose, pointing out the direction of attack, describing her injuries without dramatics. She understood instinctively that credibility would be her strongest weapon in what was clearly about to become a much bigger battle. The paramedics noted contusions and signs of soft tissue trauma, warning that swelling could worsen and that she should be evaluated at a hospital for possible internal damage. The officers, professional but slightly skeptical at first, likely used to neighborly squabbles blown out of proportion, grew more serious as they took in the scene. The marks on Riley's arms, the industrial hose left abandoned like a weapon at a crime scene, the complete lack of provocation evident from the setup of the yard. Brad and Sharon were nowhere to be seen when the officers canvassed the immediate area. No doubt they had scurried back to their houses, convinced that their little stunt would blow over with a few grumbles and some neighborly gossip. They underestimated Riley. She wasn't about to let it go, not this time. As she stood there shivering in the warm air, an ice-cold determination settled into her bones. She would pursue this properly, through the legal system, with professional witnesses and official reports. She would not be baited into a shouting match on the front lawn or into retaliating with childish antics. No, if Brad and Sharon wanted a fight, Riley Brooks would show them exactly how a real fight was conducted. With precision, with patience, and with devastating finality. The aftermath of the assault brought a cold, strategic clarity to Riley Brooks' mind. This was no longer about neighborly disputes or garden aesthetics. This was about standing up against unprovoked violence. Riley knew instinctively that acting smart was more important than acting fast, and she wasn't about to jeopardize her position by handling things emotionally or impulsively. First, she ensured that her medical reports were meticulously documented. She didn't just rely on the paramedics' notes. She visited a physician specializing in soft tissue injuries the very next morning, obtaining a detailed report that outlined the extent of the trauma she had suffered. Bruising along her ribs, strained tendons in her wrist from the impact of the fall, and multiple abrasions across her legs and arms were all meticulously catalogued. The injuries were not life-threatening, but they were significant enough to underline the seriousness of the attack in any legal setting. Next, Riley made the conscious decision not to confront Brad and Sharon directly. She understood too well how quickly narratives could be twisted when emotions ran high. Instead, she retained an attorney specializing in personal injury and neighborhood disputes, a sharp and methodical woman named Laura Green. During their first meeting, Laura listened intently, her expression growing progressively colder as Riley laid out the events in calm, factual terms. By the end of the meeting, she was nodding grimly. "We have more than enough to pursue a strong case," she said. "This wasn't an accident. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was assault." Together, they began to map out a strategy that would rely not on public outrage or media spectacle, but on cold, hard evidence and relentless legal precision. Meanwhile, Brad and Sharon were anything but quiet. In the days following the incident, Riley noticed an uptick in activity around her property. HOA notices began arriving almost daily, each citing increasingly petty infractions. A garden hose left visible from the street for more than 2 hours, an ornamental flag deemed non-compliant with community standards, even accusations that her irrigation runoff was damaging adjacent properties. Claims that were absurd given the layout and grade of her land. It was clear to Riley that Brad was using his position within the board to weaponize the system against her, attempting to bury her under a mountain of bureaucracy and nuisance penalties. Sharon, meanwhile, busied herself spreading rumors throughout the neighborhood, suggesting Riley was unstable, overly aggressive, and bringing unwanted attention to their peaceful community. Riley documented everything meticulously. Every notice was photographed and archived. Every conversation, no matter how seemingly insignificant, was summarized in detailed, time-stamped notes. She installed professional-grade security cameras around her property, not hidden, but visible enough to serve as a deterrent. The system captured hours of footage each day, cataloged and stored on secure cloud servers. She made no announcement, no declarations of defiance. She simply fortified her position quietly, methodically, turning her home into a legal fortress. It wasn't long before things escalated further. One evening, Riley found a crude, anonymous letter shoved through her mail slot. Scrawled in uneven handwriting, it accused her of disrespecting the neighborhood and warned that people around here take matters into their own hands. The implied threat was unmistakable. She didn't waste time wondering who had sent it. Instead, she added it to her growing file and reported the incident to the local police department. Because there was now a documented assault and a subsequent threat, the police took her report seriously, opening an official file and increasing patrols in the area. Still, Brad and Sharon seemed emboldened. Perhaps they believed that the legal system moved too slowly to be effective, or that Riley would eventually tire and retreat under pressure. They clearly did not understand the kind of resolve they were facing. Through her attorney, Riley filed a formal civil lawsuit against Brad Hunter for assault and battery, as well as emotional distress. At the same time, a separate complaint was filed regarding Sharon Mills for harassment and defamation, citing the spread of malicious falsehoods and her participation in the intimidation campaign. The board of the Homeowners Association, smelling trouble but unwilling to back down completely, began to quietly distance itself from Brad and Sharon in public, even as it continued to harass Riley administratively. In a particularly audacious move, Brad attempted to countersue Riley, filing a claim that she had provoked the incident by creating a hostile atmosphere in the neighborhood. The claim was so absurd, so transparently defensive, that even the initial court clerk handling the paperwork reportedly raised an eyebrow at it. Nevertheless, the tactic forced Riley and her attorney to widen their approach. They subpoenaed board meeting minutes, internal email communications, and any documentation relating to property complaints filed against Riley over the previous 3 months. What they uncovered was damning. Not only had Brad and Sharon openly discussed strategies to teach her a lesson, but other board members had expressed concern about the aggressive tactics being used. In one particularly incriminating email, Brad suggested that a little public humiliation might remind her who's in charge around here. The board president had replied with a terse warning that any action outside formal HOA guidelines could expose them to liability, a warning Brad had evidently ignored. Armed with these documents, medical reports, video evidence, and police reports, Laura Green built a case that was not simply about a neighborly spat gone wrong, but about a calculated, malicious campaign of harassment culminating in physical violence. Meanwhile, Riley maintained her calm demeanor outwardly. She continued tending her garden, greeting friendly neighbors with warmth, refusing to engage in petty arguments. But behind the scenes, every move was calculated, every step coordinated with her legal team. She had no illusions that the upcoming battle would be easy, or that justice was guaranteed. But she also knew that surrendering, giving in to bullies masquerading as community leaders, was not an option she could live with. The first court hearing was scheduled 6 weeks after the assault. It wasn't just a matter of civil damages anymore. It was a test of whether ordinary people could stand up against small-time tyrants abusing their minor authority. Riley was ready. Brad and Sharon thought they had cornered her with pressure and intimidation. What they had really done was give her the perfect opportunity to burn their entire scheme to the ground, legally and irreversibly. The day of the preliminary court hearing arrived under a gray, heavy sky, the kind that seemed to press down on the world with a suffocating weight. Riley Brooks stood outside the courthouse, her attorney Laura Green at her side, both reviewing documents one final time. Everything they had gathered, the medical reports, the security footage, the threatening letter, the HOA documents exposing internal discussions, was meticulously organized into thick folders. Yet even with the strength of their evidence, Riley felt the familiar churn of nerves in her stomach. She wasn't naive. She knew that courtrooms didn't always favor the most righteous side, especially when the defense tried to muddy the waters with counterclaims and personal attacks. This hearing wasn't about winning the entire battle, not yet, but about setting the tone, demonstrating that she was serious, that she would not be bullied or discredited. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was taut with unspoken hostility. Brad Hunter sat stiffly at the defendant's table, wearing an ill-fitting suit and a smug expression, as if he still believed that this was all some minor inconvenience that would be brushed aside with a few blustery speeches. Sharon Mills, squeezed into a conservative blouse that strained against her bulk, perched uncomfortably nearby, her face a mixture of forced composure and seething resentment. Their attorney, a cheap, fast-talking man clearly hired more for his aggressive posture than his legal acumen, leaned in close to them, whispering tactics that Riley suspected boiled down to character attacks and deflection. The opening minutes went predictably: formal introductions, a statement of the charges, and preliminary motions from both sides. Then came the moment that shifted the entire momentum of the case. Laura Green rose calmly, approached the bench, and presented the internal communications from the HOA, the ones showing Brad and Sharon plotting ways to harass Riley into submission. The judge, a no-nonsense woman with a sharp gaze, flipped through the pages slowly, her expression growing increasingly grim. When Laura spoke, she did so without flourish or dramatics, laying out a clear timeline. The unjustified HOA violations, the gossip campaigns, the threats, the assault itself. And crucially, the fact that all of it pointed to a deliberate pattern of targeted harassment rather than a spontaneous neighborly dispute. Every point was backed by documented evidence, leaving little room for interpretation. Brad's attorney attempted to object, claiming the emails were taken out of context and irrelevant to the physical incident. But the judge cut him off sharply. "Pattern of behavior is highly relevant when assessing motive and credibility," she said, fixing Brad with a look that made him shift uncomfortably in his seat. For the first time since this all began, Riley saw genuine fear flicker across his face. It was a small victory, but a crucial one. Still, Brad and Sharon didn't go down quietly. Their attorney launched into a tirade about Riley's supposed disruptive behavior, painting her as an outsider who refused to integrate with the community, insinuating that her landscaping choices were a deliberate affront to neighborhood values. Sharon even attempted to testify that Riley had intimidated her by glaring during HOA meetings, a claim so ridiculous that a few observers in the gallery actually snickered audibly. But again, Laura was prepared. She presented affidavits from several neighbors, respectable, long-term residents, who attested to Riley's quiet demeanor, her friendly interactions, and the clear, unmistakable pattern of harassment coming from Brad and Sharon. One neighbor, a retired schoolteacher with no personal ties to Riley, had even witnessed Brad aggressively yelling at her over her choice of garden sculptures months before the assault. The final blow of the day came when the judge reviewed the police report of the assault itself. The officer's notes highlighted the visible injuries on Riley, the industrial-grade hose left abandoned at the scene, and the lack of any plausible justification for Brad's actions. Combined with the threatening letter and the security footage, which, while not capturing the actual moment of assault due to the angle, clearly showed Brad approaching with the hose and Riley falling back moments later, the weight of the evidence became undeniable. Before adjourning, the judge made several critical rulings. She dismissed Brad's counterclaim entirely, calling it frivolous and lacking any credible foundation. She allowed Riley's suit to proceed to full trial with all claims intact, including the emotional distress and punitive damages components. Furthermore, she issued a temporary restraining order against both Brad and Sharon, barring them from approaching Riley's property or contacting her in any way. Walking out of the courthouse, Riley felt a profound, almost disorienting sense of relief. It wasn't over. Not by a long shot, the trial still lay ahead. But the tide had turned. She wasn't simply reacting anymore. She was forcing them to play defense, forcing them into mistakes they could no longer hide behind procedural games. Laura, ever the pragmatist, cautioned her not to celebrate too early. "They'll get desperate now," she warned. "Cornered people do stupid things." Riley nodded, already bracing herself for the next wave. She knew Brad and Sharon well enough by now to understand that humiliation would only make them more dangerous. But she also knew something even more important. They were fighting a losing battle, and she wasn't going to give them a single inch to recover. In the weeks following the preliminary hearing, the atmosphere around Riley Brooks' home shifted from tense to outright hostile. What had once been subtle hostility, glances, murmurs, minor inconveniences, evolved into a campaign of calculated pressure. Brad and Sharon, humiliated and increasingly isolated, turned to less traceable tactics to make Riley's life difficult. It began with the small, almost laughable annoyances. Piles of yard waste mysteriously dumped at the edge of her property overnight, anonymous complaints about noise violations when Riley wasn't even home, and strange out-of-place inspections conducted by board-affiliated contractors who claimed to be checking for compliance issues. Each incident by itself was too minor to provoke official action, but together, they painted a clear picture. A coordinated effort to grind Riley down, through 1,000 tiny cuts. Yet Riley had anticipated escalation. Working with Laura Green, she had already filed protective orders that covered not just direct contact, but harassment through third parties. Every contractor visit, every bogus complaint, every suspicious incident was meticulously documented and reported. Her property, now monitored by a network of cameras and motion sensors, provided an undeniable trail of evidence. She wasn't just defending herself anymore. She was methodically building a secondary case that could expose Brad, Sharon, and their enablers to even greater legal liability. Things reached a new level of aggression when Riley returned home one evening to find deep gouges carved into the side of her vehicle, the metallic paint shredded as if by a heavy key or knife. The act wasn't random vandalism. Nothing else on the street was touched. It was targeted, personal, a message delivered under cover of darkness. Riley didn't waste a second. She called the police, who photographed the damage and took a report. She handed over her security footage, and while the cameras hadn't captured the vandal in the act directly, a grainy video showed a figure matching Sharon Mills's size and gait lurking near the driveway late at night, carrying what appeared to be a heavy object. It wasn't ironclad proof, but it added another heavy brick to the growing wall of evidence. At Laura's urging, Riley also expanded her legal action. A motion was filed to add charges of property destruction and seek further damages, both punitive and compensatory. By this point, Laura had constructed a profile of sustained, escalating harassment that painted Brad and Sharon not merely as vindictive neighbors, but as dangerous individuals exhibiting a pattern of retaliatory violence. But perhaps the most unexpected development came from within the neighborhood itself. As news of the court proceedings and the mounting evidence circulated, discreetly at first, then with increasing openness, several other residents approached Riley, quietly but firmly, to express their support. A few admitted they too had been harassed or bullied by the board members in the past, but had been too intimidated or weary to challenge it. One elderly couple recounted how Sharon had tried to fine them thousands of dollars for unauthorized plantings because they had dared to plant a small vegetable patch. Another family spoke of Brad's attempts to block their home renovation by manipulating permit approvals through back-channel contacts. Empowered by Riley's stand, a group of residents began to organize, gathering statements and forming an informal coalition to challenge the entrenched power structure that had allowed Brad and Sharon to operate unchecked for so long. They weren't interested in drama or revenge. They wanted fairness, accountability, and an end to the petty tyranny that had poisoned their community. Quiet meetings were held, documents were shared, and one by one, the narrative Brad and Sharon had spent years cultivating, that they were the guardians of order and tradition, began to collapse. Of course, Brad and Sharon fought back, doubling down on their tactics. Brad filed yet another nuisance complaint against Riley, claiming that runoff from her garden was causing erosion damage to community property. Sharon, emboldened by her anger and perhaps desperate enough to believe her own delusions, stood up during a board meeting and accused Riley of orchestrating a personal vendetta against her and jeopardizing the harmony of the neighborhood. Her voice cracked under the strain of her own fury, and several attendees openly rolled their eyes or shook their heads, no longer willing to pretend that her words carried weight. Meanwhile, the legal system continued its slow but relentless march forward. Depositions were scheduled, and when Brad and Sharon were required to sit under oath, their carefully constructed stories began to unravel. Brad, visibly sweating and fidgeting, struggled to explain why he had previously denied any personal involvement in the compliance complaints when emails showed him directly orchestrating them. Sharon, confronted with security footage, shifted uncomfortably and claimed faulty memory, but the inconsistencies in her statements stacked up like kindling waiting for a spark. Laura Green, unrelenting as ever, used these weaknesses mercilessly. Every contradiction, every gap in memory, every conveniently forgotten detail was highlighted and preserved in the deposition transcripts. She understood that trials were not just won by the strength of evidence, but by systematically dismantling the opposition's credibility until nothing they said could be trusted. And still, through it all, Riley maintained her calm. She continued tending to her garden, her oasis of beauty amidst the ugliness that surrounded her, refusing to let the harassment dictate her life or sour her love for the home she had built. She understood now that Brad and Sharon's campaign against her was not truly about gardens or HOA bylaws or neighborhood aesthetics. It was about control, about punishing someone who refused to be subjugated by fear or intimidation. By the time the date for the full civil trial was set, it was clear to everyone — Brad, Sharon, their exhausted attorney, the remaining board members desperately trying to salvage their reputations — that this was no longer a manageable dispute. It was a reckoning. The evidence was overwhelming, the support for Riley growing, and the entire neighborhood watching closely. Brad and Sharon had started this fight thinking they could dominate through pressure and bullying. Instead, they had created their own downfall, brick by brick, cut by petty cut, until they were trapped in a cage of their own making with no easy way out. Riley wasn't just seeking damages anymore. She was seeking a full public accounting of everything they had done, and she was going to get it. The trial opened under an oppressive heatwave that seemed almost symbolic, as if the universe itself intended to wring every last drop of tension from the proceedings. The courtroom was packed, not just with legal teams and a scattering of journalists, but with dozens of curious neighbors who had followed the saga from whispered rumors to open discussions at every community gathering. Riley Brooks sat composed at the plaintiff's table, her expression calm but resolute, her attorney Laura Green beside her radiating quiet, lethal professionalism. Across the aisle, Brad Hunter and Sharon Mills looked like pale shadows of their former arrogant selves. Brad fidgeted constantly, unable to meet anyone's gaze, while Sharon perched stiffly in her chair, her bulk dwarfed by a cheap, ill-fitting blazer that strained at every seam, her hands clenching and unclenching nervously in her lap. The judge, the same sharp-eyed woman from the preliminary hearing, wasted no time. Opening statements were brisk. Laura presented a clear narrative of unprovoked harassment, escalating violence, and deliberate abuse of authority. Brad and Sharon's lawyer, visibly less confident now, tried to paint Riley as a disruptive element who had refused to integrate into the community, but the weight of the documented evidence had already poisoned any goodwill he might have hoped for. No one in the room, least of all the jury, seemed inclined to believe that a peaceful woman who had quietly tended her garden and lived without complaint could somehow be responsible for the spiraling ugliness that had unfolded. Witness testimony drove the final nails into Brad and Sharon's coffin. One after another, residents stood and described the systematic pressure tactics used by the board, not just against Riley, but against anyone who dared to be different. A retired engineer recounted how Brad had threatened to fine him for minor yard infractions after he refused to donate to a board-sponsored event. A young mother described Sharon publicly humiliating her at a meeting over a supposed fence violation that didn't even exist according to the bylaws. Every story painted the same picture. A petty regime that had operated unchecked for years, using fear and bureaucracy as weapons. Then came the physical evidence. Laura Green methodically presented the photographs of Riley's injuries, the detailed medical reports, the police filings, the footage showing Brad wielding the industrial hose, the vandalized vehicle, the anonymous threats. Each piece was delivered without fanfare, each one a blow that further dismantled whatever defense Brad and Sharon had tried to cobble together. When the internal HOA emails were projected onto a screen, showing Brad mocking Riley's garden and discussing how to humble her with fines and inspections, an audible gasp rippled through the courtroom. Perhaps the most devastating moment came when Sharon was called to the stand. Her attempt to appear composed lasted barely 5 minutes under Laura's cross-examination. Pressed on her presence near Riley's property late at night, her knowledge of the vandalism and the language used in the anonymous letters, Sharon's story crumbled. She stammered, contradicted herself, and finally burst out with a bitter, barely coherent tirade about people like Riley who thought they were better than everyone else. That slip, that unguarded, venomous flash of her real feelings, hung in, the air like smoke, and there was no taking it back. Brad didn't fare much better. Confronted with his own words in emails and meeting minutes, he could only offer weak denials and claims of poor memory that collapsed under the simplest scrutiny. When pressed about the day of the assault, his excuses veered from "it was a joke" to "she slipped before I even turned on the water" to "I thought she'd find it funny," each more pitiful than the last. By the time his testimony ended, he seemed to have shrunk into his chair, a man utterly defeated by the evidence of his own malice and arrogance. The closing arguments were almost a formality. Laura reminded the jury that this was not a case of misunderstandings or neighborhood disagreements gone awry. It was a clear, deliberate pattern of harassment that had culminated in physical violence. She urged them to send a message that such behavior had no place in any community, no matter how small. Brad and Sharon's lawyer mumbled something about overzealousness and miscommunication, but it was obvious his heart wasn't even in it anymore. When the jury returned after less than 3 hours of deliberation, their verdict was swift and unanimous: guilty on all counts. Brad Hunter was found liable for assault, battery, emotional distress, and punitive damages. Sharon Mills was found liable for harassment, defamation, and contributory negligence. The damages awarded were significant. Enough to hurt, enough to be felt for years. But it wasn't the money that mattered most to Riley. It was the fact that the verdict was public, undeniable, carved into the legal record for anyone to see. Brad and Sharon's reputations, once bloated by years of unchecked power, were destroyed in the span of a single afternoon. As the judge thanked the jury and adjourned the court, a hush fell over the room. For a moment, no one moved. Then slowly, quietly, a few of the spectators, neighbors who had once been too afraid to speak, began to nod at Riley, small gestures of solidarity and gratitude. It wasn't a standing ovation, wasn't noisy or dramatic, but it was genuine. Riley met their eyes, acknowledging each nod with a steady gaze, feeling not triumph, but a deep, bone-tired sense of justice finally served. Outside the courthouse, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the steps. Brad and Sharon slunk away quickly, avoiding eye contact, clutching folders to their chests like battered shields. Laura Green stood beside Riley, arms folded, a rare smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. "It's done," she said simply. Riley nodded. It wasn't just about winning a case. It was about reclaiming her home, her peace, and her right to live without fear. And no matter what came next, no matter what petty aftershocks Brad and Sharon might try to stir up, that victory, that hard, honest victory, was hers to keep. In the days and weeks following the verdict, the neighborhood shifted in ways both subtle and profound. Riley Brooks found herself walking through her garden with a new sense of ease. The heavy weight of tension that had once clung to her home lifted at last. The bright flowers and carefully tended trees seemed somehow more vivid, the air lighter. Although she had never sought to become a symbol, neighbors now treated her with a quiet respect, many offering nods, small waves, or brief, genuine conversations over the fence. The coalition of residents who had once supported her behind closed doors became more visible, attending board meetings with renewed energy and purpose, determined to ensure that the abuses of power that had flourished under Brad and Sharon's influence would not be repeated. The board, now under the control of a provisional committee elected by emergency vote, moved swiftly to implement reforms. Rules were rewritten to limit the discretionary power of board members. Transparency measures were introduced, and new channels for dispute resolution were opened to prevent the kind of unchecked harassment Riley had endured. Brad Hunter, facing the financial burden of the court's judgment and the collapse of his standing, quietly sold his home and moved out of the neighborhood within 2 months. Sharon Mills, stripped of whatever clout she once wielded and shunned even by her former allies, retreated into isolation, rarely seen beyond the threshold of her house. For Riley, the victory was never about forcing anyone out or destroying lives. It had always been about the simple, stubborn belief that no one should have to live in fear within their own home. She continued her life much as she had before, tending her garden, welcoming new neighbors, and finding peace in the small daily rituals she loved. But now there was a difference. An underlying strength. An unspoken message that she had earned her place not through compliance or quiet endurance, but through resilience, patience, and an unwavering commitment to standing her ground against those who would see kindness as weakness. One evening, as the sun dipped low and bathed her garden in gold, Riley stood by the small stone fountain she had built herself, watching the water catch the last light of the day. It was a simple thing, a quiet thing, but in that moment it felt like the culmination of every battle fought and every injustice endured. She understood now, more than ever, that true peace was never given freely. It had to be claimed, defended, and tended with the same care as a living, growing thing. And as the first stars blinked to life overhead, Riley smiled to herself, knowing that whatever storms might come in the future, she was ready to weather them, and that finally, she was truly home.